Good morning. I am losing my voice, and so bear with me if I start to cut in and out. I've been trying to take care of it, but I was a little bit sick yesterday, so I just been staying away from everyone. I don't want anyone to blame coming to church on getting sick. And so my voice is a little bit raspier than normal. It sounds more annoying than normal, but hopefully you can all bear with me for it. I am speaking through the second part of this series. It's a three-part series on 100, which is what we talk about when we're talking about stewardship. And when I think about money, I think about the movie The Jerk. Have you ever seen the movie The Jerk? Say one. All right, second service is best so far. I need to update you on films and what's important in film. The Jerk is one of those important films that we should all watch. Actually, just kidding, don't go watch it if it's rated R. But I'm an old soul. I love old Steve Martin comedies. Also because when I watch it, I realize he really hasn't aged. His hair's always been gray since he was young. And so it gives me hope for my baldness that's happening back there. But there's a scene in the movie that I almost always think of toward the end of the film when I'm thinking about money. Let's take a look. So the ending of this movie, spoiler alert, the movie's 41 years old. You don't get a spoiler alert anymore. But the ending of the movie has Steve Martin living homeless in Skid Row. His adoptive family comes and finds him. That's the first place they look. That's what they said. And they bring him back home. And they're doing pretty well, though, because all throughout Steve Martin's life, as he left home, he began to send money home based upon his earnings as a gas pump attendant or as a weight guesser at a carnival. And all this time he's sending money home, and they saved that and they invested it, and then they're able to do pretty well for themselves. Not like great, but by where they were doing a lot better. But the story of this movie is about a young man who is an idiot. That's how the synopsis goes online. Who starts out poor, works low-paying jobs, becomes wealthy, and then he loses it all. He started out with nothing, but once he had everything, he had become so accustomed to that life that he didn't know how to function outside of it, which hence the this is all I need scene. I think that this is probably how some of us might view money. We think to ourselves that this is all we need. All we need to be happy, all we need to save is this amount of money, and that's all we need. And we're walking through the house picking up random things like this ashtray and these matches and this lamp. This is all I need to be happy, and then I'm happy. And we see that money can't really change you, right? It can't change the way that you think. It can't change the way that you really inherently believe what money is. We see this comedically displayed in the movie, in the scene where Steve Martin and his wife, Bernadette Peters, goes out for dinner, and she orders escargot, and when it comes out, he yells at the waiter for bringing snails. How dare you put snails on my wife's plate? That's disgusting. She doesn't want those things on her plate. And so we see that money can't really change the way that you think and what you know. Last week, Pastor Monk kicked off this series by setting up the principle of 10, 10, 80. The first 10% goes to... Did somebody say Joe? No? Who's Joe? And why is he getting 10% of your... The first 10% goes to God, church. All right, you guys are a little... Let's wake up. The next 10% goes to savings, and then the final 80% is what you live off. And that's just kind of a financial principle. Dave Ramsey talks about it a lot. And since I've been given the task of talking about saving, I want to walk this fine line between saving and hoarding. Because a lot of us treat savings like what we're hoarding away, right? We're just stashing it all away, and we don't want anyone to ever touch it. And one day we'll use it, but that day never actually comes, and we just realize that we've had all this money saved away. In fact, there's a story early last year, about Eugene Brown, who was a recluse that died without anyone in his life. No wife, no family, no one. And whenever they were going to investigate his estate, whenever the public administrators were going to investigate that, they found out that he had $2.7 million in assets. Now, luckily, he had no will. So it made their job a little bit more difficult. They did find that he had a will that was filled out, but it wasn't signed, so they can't really do anything about that. And then we see family members start popping up out of nowhere, right? Whenever family hears, they're like, oh, this person has money. I'm his long-lost cousin. It grieves me so much to see him gone. He was just like family. And what they ended up having to do, because of California law, was split the money between the family because there was no will. Now, the public administrators think that the will is actually where he wanted the money to go, and the money was going to go to a Catholic charity. But since it wasn't signed, they couldn't do anything about it. So I don't want you to live your life saving all this money, and not being smart about it, and then dying with $2.7 million, realizing that you haven't really lived your life, that you hadn't really helped others out, that you've just saved all this money for no reason, right? It's not how we want to live. But I also want us to be conscious of the future. Saving is a difficult concept because many of us are trying to get to a net balance of zero, right? We're all trying to get to that zero level to pay off credit card debts, mortgages, car payments, student loan debt, hospital bills, etc. We're all just trying to pay those things off so that we can finally be in the black. We're tired of being in the red. And we use every little bit of extra from our paycheck to pay off our debts. But the truth is, the future is uncertain and we don't know what will happen. But we can't look to saving as a way to trust in ourselves more than we trust in God. And that's the issue I have with saving, is that sometimes we save because we want to be able to trust in our own ability to cause the future, to change the future, rather than trusting God. So today, turn to Genesis 41, and we're going to be looking at the story of Joseph. Now, I'm not too much of a fan of Joseph because I watched Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and I don't like that musical, so now I don't like Joseph. It's hard for me to read the story and to see him outside of that. I root for the brothers every time. So I'm going to try to separate those feelings as I read the story today, though. Let's look at where we are in the story of Joseph. Joseph has been imprisoned because he denied the advances of Potiphar's wife, right? If you remember the story, he won't sleep with her even though she wants to sleep with him, and she accuses him, and then he goes to prison. And while in prison, he interprets 2 dreams, and they come true. And then Pharaoh asks for dreams to be interpreted, and no one can tell him what his dreams mean. So he hears about Joseph down in prison, and that's where the story picks up in verse 14. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I've heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterward you would have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And then the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I had told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain, withered by the east wind, represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I've described it, for God revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. So if you know the rest of the story, you know that Pharaoh follows the advice of Joseph, right? He follows the advice, they store the food, everything goes according to plan, except there's some changes at the end which we'll address. Joseph's put in charge of everything, and he acts out everything, and he saves the day. It's a great story. And we tell this story when we're talking about saving, because we're like, put away some in the storehouse. That way, when years of famine come, you'll have enough set aside. And we use it in a very kind of just stoic fashion of saying, save this, save this, save this. And my problem with doing that is that when we say save 10%, we oftentimes remove the most important part of this story. And that is the component of God within this story. You see, this isn't a story about, this is why you should save, because then you'll have everything you need whenever life takes a wrong turn. But we use it in that sense. I like what Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann says about this passage. He says, the power of God is contrasted with the feeble power of Pharaoh. The criterion of the true God is that God is the one who can cause a future. In Genesis 41, it is clear that Pharaoh can cause no future, nor can he resist the future that God will bring. The royal way is to think that the future must be derived from the present through careful planning and calculation. But in this quiet, confident speech, Joseph ends that notion of the future. It is God, not royal power or imperial planning, who will cause the future. It is this God who will give life and bring death, who will cause the Nile to produce or cause famine to grow. The intervention of God does not end royal responsibility, but sets it in a context where a new course of action is required. God's purpose is not the end of human planning, but the ground for it. That God's plan is above human plans does not mean that there should not be human planning. It means that it must be responsive and faithful to God's plan. We can't treat saving in a way to where we think that it's going to cause the future, because it doesn't. This is how the royals believed back then. This is what Brueggemann is saying about Pharaoh and God is really a contrast between two gods. You have the God, and then you have in the mind's eye what they viewed as God, which is Pharaoh. And they're saying Pharaoh has no power over the future. God has all the power over the future. And God has given you a glimpse into what that's going to look like. But nothing you can do will change it. And yet we still sometimes save and plan thinking that we can change the outcome of the future by putting away 10% out of every single paycheck into a savings account. But it doesn't change the future, does it? A lot of us have learned that the hard way. A lot of you learned that the hard way, because I was still in college in 2008 when a lot of people's future took a different turn. When people who had planned and saved for retirement all of a sudden realized we're going to have to plan and save many more years than what we had originally intended. The future changed on them. When I graduated from college, I was really left with two options: to continue education, which is always a great idea with student loan debt, continue your education, or do an unpaid internship, because jobs really weren't hiring. We do these things where we think that we're going to change the outcome of the future, Or at least we're going to put enough away that if the outcome does change, we'll be ready for it. But we're never truly ready for it. We put our trust in our savings account more than we do in God. Some people after that, they swung in the opposite direction and they began to invest in more low-risk stocks and investments, thinking that they could save more and more and more and more and more just in case the future changed again. And all you have to do is listen to the news for 5 minutes a day, right? Any financial thing, and they're saying, this is telling us that this is going to happen. This is telling us that this is about to burst, and this number, and this number, and this number. And all of us are thinking it's all uncertain, right? We don't really know what's going to happen. And so we save and we save and we save, thinking that if the bottom falls out in the future, at least I'll know I'll be fine because of how much I have saved away. We kind of begin to put more trust in our savings account than we do in God. And it's just like Pastor Mott pointed out in reading that parable last week, that the focus wasn't on God, but on their own work. And when we treat savings like that, we begin to think we can be God and we can change the course of the future. So when I talk about saving 10%, when I talk about putting 10% away, I want you to know that I'm far from this. I'm far from perfect with this. I hope to get there, but like many of you, sometimes due to poor decisions, it takes us a lot longer to get there. In this story, we see the importance of saving. We do. But we also have to understand what is happening in the greater picture of Egypt and Pharaoh and within Joseph's story. And I think Walter Brueggemann says it correctly when he says that God's plan is above human plans does not mean that there should not be human planning. It means that it must be responsive and faithful to God's plan. There's always that church sign slogan that says, you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. That's not 100% true because there's still human planning, but it has to be done within God's plan. And we have to lean into God. We have to trust God, and we have to remain faithful to God in our planning. It doesn't give us a free pass. It doesn't mean just go live your life and throw money all over. But it means to listen to God, to see what he's doing, to read his word, to know what he has in store, and to plan according to that. Now, has God come to you recently and told you the next 14 years of life? No, he's not come to me either. I was hoping he came to one of you, but he hasn't really done that. So we really have to look to Scripture to see where God is moving. And in 2 Corinthians 5, we read this work about a work of reconciliation, that God is reconciling the world to himself through Christ, that he is spreading this message of reconciliation. And he said that you are ambassadors. You have been called ambassadors to this plan, that you are to go and to carry that message to other parts of the world, saying, this is what God is doing in the world. He is reconciling. He is settling the accounts. He has settled them. He is bringing the world to himself, redeeming all of creation, showing what he has in store. The original beauty of the world is what he has in store. No more sickness, hopefully, is what he has in store. No more ailments, no more debts. None of these things are what the world was supposed to be, and God is reconciling the world to himself through Christ. That's the fullness of the good news. Not just that you go to heaven when you die, but that God brings it all here and brings it all together and makes it all new. And so when we talk about saving, we have to talk about it in that light. We have to talk about it in this way of understanding that God is making things new. And so you can save all you want, but if we're not doing it in that way, then I think that we're hoarding away resources that could be used to spread the good news. At the end of the story of Joseph, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt because they hear there's food, right? They're a little bit greedy. But they come to Egypt because they hear there's food. And they see Joseph, but they don't recognize him. But Joseph recognizes them, right? If you've read the story, he recognizes them. He knows who they are. And he plays a little bit of a game with them because Joseph is a jerk. Just kidding. No. See, I don't like that musical. But he plays a little bit of a game with them, and he gives them some things. And then he finally reveals himself, and he kind of reconciles those relationships, right? He says, go and bring my father back so that he knows that I'm alive. There's this beautiful story of reconciliation, and it's kind of disjointed in how it's in there, but it's there. And obviously, this is not the main point of the famine. God didn't say, you know what, Joseph's family is a little bit, they're just dysfunctional, so I'm going to cause a famine so that way they're forced to reconcile their relationship. No, that's not the whole point of the famine, but it did bring it about. Within that idea of saving, there was a work of reconciliation which was taking place. And if you continue to read the story, which we oftentimes glance over the end of it, you'll see that there is a lack of food. People are running out of their savings. People start coming to Joseph saying, we're out of food. What can we do? And he says, bring me your livestock and I'll give you food. Bring me this and I'll give you grain. Sell yourself to Pharaoh as a slave and we will take care of you. It ends a little bit exploited, right? And if you know a little bit about the next book, Exodus kind of picks up with slavery in Egypt. So even within all the planning that they did, there was still a lack, right? Even within all the planning, there was still a lack. So yes, save 10%. Set 10% aside. I'm not saying that isn't important. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be smart, that you shouldn't set aside for that rainy day, but I'm also saying don't put your faith in that 10% set aside. Don't say to yourself, I know I'll be okay because I have this set aside. Say, I know that I'll be okay because I follow God and God alone. That I put my trust in Him and not in anything in my bank account. Because we've all seen that money disappear. A lot of people have seen all of those funds disappear when they thought it would be there for them whenever they retired and were able to finally take a break from work. But I'm saying save 10% so that you can also proclaim God's message of reconciliation to this world. Because ultimately we see that fruit from Joseph setting aside all those resources. We see that fruit of proclaiming reconciliation. And we should be saving and giving in this continual motion. You should save so that you can give freely to others. You should save so that you can help one another, so that we can continue to give to each other. Yes, you should save so that you can buy things and not go into debt and become a slave to Pharaoh, but you should also save so that you can proclaim the good news of the gospel that God is reconciling all the world to Himself through Christ, or as we say, to know Christ fully and make Him known. The end of this story baffles me. I don't know how to fully read into it with Joseph's move to force people into slavery for more food. Maybe the people weren't wise enough. They didn't save enough. You know, we say those things too, right? They weren't smart enough. This is what happens when you don't do this. This is what happens when you don't do that. But I do know that God doesn't look at us in that way. And He's never once said to us, you should have been smarter, right? He never once looks at us and says, you should have saved more money. You should have not sinned. No, what we see with God is that father, the prodigal son who runs out to meet his son and he hugs him and he brings him home. And that's the message that we are to be proclaiming. So saving is important, but understanding this message of grace of God and how He has dealt with us is also important. About 4 to 5 years ago, I found myself in a situation where I wished that I would have saved money. The transmission on my Jeep went out, and I don't know if you've ever had a transmission go out on a vehicle, but it's like, I've had 3. I guess I'm bad with transmissions. I like to wear them out, but A transmission went out on the Jeep and I didn't know what I was going to do. That's a huge bill. It's about $1,800 to fix that. Now this would have been somewhat okay, probably not. It would never have been okay, but I had a back surgery that same time. So I'm also dealing with that and those payments. And I guess health insurance doesn't make things free, so you still have to pay them. I don't know why, but we still had to pay them. I still had to pay them for that. And I remember thinking, if $1,800 could just magically show up, that would be great right now. Heck, if $1,800 could magically show up right now, that would be great. But back then, definitely, it would have been great. And I remember someone from the church had heard about it, and they called and they reached out to me and said that they'd been saving up some money, and whereas they couldn't cover it all, they covered a very significant portion of it. And I remember being humbled by that, because it's hard to ask for help from people. It's hard to accept help from people sometimes. We save up and we see someone in need and we're like, that person needs to know the work of reconciliation. That God has forgiven debts. That God is bringing beauty and justice into this world. That person needs to know that. And I have saved up money and I'm going to demonstrate that to them with this. I think we see those stories and it reminds us of the good that is in people, because yes, you should save, but you should save loosely, right? Knowing that the future is uncertain and you could lose it all, but you can impact so many lives if you just looked at the work of reconciliation that God is doing in this world. You could change so many lives. So yes, save. Make human plans, but make human plans understanding God's future plans, and recognize that nothing you can do can determine or cause the future. Only God can. Trust in that and in that alone, not with how many zeros you have in your savings account. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we are grateful and thankful that you have forgiven us, Lord, for so much. God, that you have shown us grace when we've made so many mistakes, that you have canceled our debts, Lord, that you have reminded us that you're bringing this world to yourself. God, your kingdom is here and you're showing it. God, may we be conscious of that. May remind us that we are partners with you in this. And God, may we use all of our resources to demonstrate the work that your Son has done, that you are doing this good news, God, that is truly good news. We love you and praise your name. Amen.